Wars are fought over land, resources, and power. Sometimes wars can be won or lost based on one single battle. And even more rarely, a war's outcome can be determined by a single decision. Here are 10 military mistakes that change the course of wars. Number 10. The Battle of Karansebes. The Battle of Karansebes was fought between the armies of Hungary and Serbia in the early days of World War II. This battle is remembered for being one of the first major disasters suffered by German ally Hungary. At the time, Hungary was under the rule of Regent Miklos Horthy, who had risen to power with the support of the Arrow Cross Party, a far-right group with ties to the Nazis. After declaring war on Yugoslavia and joining the Axis powers, Hungary sent out its army to conquer territory. The Royal Hungarian Army advanced through the Balkans towards Belgrade, aiming to take the city within 3 days. However, they were met by Yugoslav forces led by General Vladimir Lazic. Instead of taking 3 days, it took the Hungarians 2 weeks to capture Belgrade. During the siege, both sides committed atrocities against each other. But when the Yugoslavs retreated from Belgrade, the Hungarians gave chase and found themselves facing off against the rest of the Yugoslav army. The Hungarians had expected the Yugoslavs to set up defensive positions and thought they would be able to easily pick them off one by one. But instead, Lazic attacked. The unprepared Hungarians were utterly crushed and forced to retreat. This defeat marked the end of Hungary's participation in World War II. Number 9. Operation Bagration. The turning point of the war between Russia and Nazi Germany came during the summer of 1943, when Soviet troops began pushing back the Germans from the area around Stalingrad. By late 1943, the Red Army was ready to launch a full-scale attack against the Germans. This attack, known as Operation Bagration, caught the Germans completely by surprise. The Soviets had managed to keep their plans secret and were able to move 5,000 troops into position without the Germans noticing. On July 1943, the Soviets launched their attack. They split their forces into 3 groups. The Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Bryansk fronts were responsible for tearing open a hole in the center of the German lines, while the troops stationed near Stalingrad held off any reinforcements coming from the south. The plan was then for the German forces in the Baltic states to drive west and link up with the troops in Stalingrad. It was an ambitious plan, but it worked. The Germans were driven back across the Dnieper River, opening up a huge swath of territory behind enemy lines. This allowed the Soviets to push the Germans all the way to the outskirts of Berlin, where the war would eventually end. 8. The Great Fire of London. In the year 1666, London was struck by a series of devastating fires that would leave thousands of people homeless and help pave the way for England to become a world power. On September 2nd, a fire broke out in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Street. Within hours, the entire street was engulfed in flames, and the fire quickly spread to the surrounding areas. 5 days later, the fire was finally extinguished, but not before leaving 130 square miles of London in ruins. 5,000 houses were burned down, and 1,000 people were left homeless. While the Great Fire of London did not directly lead to any significant military engagements, it did have some indirect effects. For example, the fire helped to weaken the Anglo-Dutch alliance, which had been a major factor in the Third Anglo-Dutch War. With so many of England's resources devoted to rebuilding London, it simply could not afford to continue the war. As a result, peace negotiations were opened, and the war ended in 1667 with the Treaty of Breda. 7. French mistakes at Yorktown. France's last gasp attempt to hold on to North America as a colonial power took place at the Siege of Quebec in 1759. French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm and British General James Wolfe led their respective armies in a battle to the death. Both leaders would die in the battle, but the British would win, capturing the city of Quebec and driving the French out of Canada. Although the French had lost Canada, they were still holding on to territories in the Mississippi River Valley. In order to regain these lost territories, the French would form an alliance with Spain and went to war against the British. Once again, France would be defeated and lose all of their remaining territory in North America. One of the biggest reasons for this defeat was a simple mistake made by French soldiers during the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The French were on the verge of winning the battle when a group of American soldiers dressed up as British soldiers snuck into their camp and fired on them. Caught completely by surprise, the French were unable to mount a defense and were forced to surrender. This effectively ended the war and ceded all of France's remaining territory in North America to the United States. Number 6. Battle of Caransebes. In 1914, Europe was tense as the Austrians were preparing for intervention in the ongoing conflict between Serbia and Montenegro. However, disaster struck at the Battle of Caransebes, which resulted in hundreds of casualties and one controversial death. Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was visiting the city of Caransebes in hopes of calming tensions between Serbia and Austria. However, when his motorcade arrived at the city, he was greeted by a crowd of angry citizens. A local revolutionary named Gavrilo Princip opened fire on the Archduke, killing him and his wife. While the motive behind the assassination is still debated, it is clear that this event would have a huge impact on the future of Europe. The Austrians used this incident as a reason to declare war on Serbia and began their invasion. This marked the beginning of World War I and would lead to millions of deaths across the continent. Number 5. Soviet mistakes in Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a disastrous event that showed the world that the Soviet Union was not the superpower everyone thought it was. From the very beginning, the Soviets underestimated the Afghan people and their will to fight for freedom. The Soviets had expected the Afghan people to welcome them as liberators, but instead were met with fierce resistance. The Soviets were also not prepared for the harsh terrain of Afghanistan and were quickly bogged down by the rugged mountains and vast deserts. Despite the setbacks, the Soviets continued to press on, hoping to achieve victory. However, this proved to be a fatal mistake. The Soviet leadership failed to learn from their previous mistakes and continued to pour men and resources into the conflict. Eventually, the Soviets were forced to withdraw from Afghanistan in 1989, having suffered over 15,000 casualties in the process. The war in Afghanistan had a major impact on the Soviet Union, contributing to its eventual collapse in 1991. Number 4. British mistakes in Palestine. In 1947, the British government decided to partition Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab. This decision was based on the belief that this would lead to a peaceful resolution of the ongoing conflict between the two groups. However, this was a grave mistake that would lead to decades of violence and instability in the region. The British had failed to consult with the Palestinians or the Arabs in general before making this decision. This led to widespread opposition from both sides, with the Jews believing that the proposed state was too small, and the Arabs believing that it would never accept a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. On May 14, 1948, just hours after the British left, the State of Israel was proclaimed, despite the strong opposition from the Arab world. This decision has led to decades of conflict in the region and has resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Number 3. U.S. mistakes in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was one of the longest and most controversial conflicts in U.S. history. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the U.S. was involved in a costly and divisive war that ultimately resulted in the fall of Saigon and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. One of the biggest mistakes made by the U.S. during the Vietnam War was its failure to understand the Vietnamese people and their culture. The U.S. military was unable to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, which was essential to winning the war. This led to a growing anti-war movement at home and ultimately to the withdrawal of the U.S. from Vietnam in 1973. The war would come to an end 2 years later with the fall of Saigon. Number 2. Hitler's invasion of Russia. When Adolf Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, he believed that he would be able to quickly capture Moscow and force the Soviets to surrender. However, this was a disastrous mistake that would ultimately lead to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Hitler's invasion of Russia was a massive undertaking that involved the largest land invasion in history. The German army advanced deep into Soviet territory, but they were soon met with fierce resistance. The Soviets were able to inflict heavy casualties on the Germans and eventually pushed them back. Despite suffering massive losses, Hitler refused to abandon his invasion of Russia. This led to the Battle of Stalingrad, which was one of the deadliest battles in history. After months of fighting, the Germans were forced to retreat from Stalingrad. This marked the turning point of World War II and ultimately led to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Number 1. The bombing of Dresden. The bombing of Dresden was one of the most destructive air raids of World War II. The city of Dresden was heavily damaged and thousands of civilians were killed. The raid was controversial because of the heavy civilian casualties and the fact that Dresden was not a military target. The bombing of Dresden was carried out by the British and American air forces. The goal of the raid was to destroy German factories and infrastructure. However, Dresden was not a military target, and the raid resulted in the deaths of thousands of German civilians. The raid was controversial because of the heavy civilian casualties and the fact that Dresden was not a military target. The bombing of Dresden remains a controversial event, and it has sparked debate for decades. Some historians argue that the raid was necessary to win the war, while others argue that it was a war crime. Which of these events do you think had the biggest impact on the course of history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video.